Creating an accessory item with pose using IMVU's Studio Toolkit is essentially a two-part process. First, we have to make the accessory mesh itself using the clothing tool, which we then import into the animation tool. So to do this, make sure that we are starting from a clean scene. So File, New, General. This ensures the toolkit is able to load in all the parts that we need. Next, View, Sidebar. That's where the toolkit lives. And then in the IMVU Studio Toolkit tab, click that, and we have the tools or the options that we've got available. So to make the accessory item, instead of using the attachment tool, which is what we would normally use, for items with poses, we have to use the clothing tool. So expand the options and then just click on the Append clothing file. This will load in the avatar with the avatar skeleton. And we use this because we need to attach our mesh to specific named bones of the avatar in order for it to work as an accessory with an attachment, versus if they are accessories accompanied by a pose or something else. So with that in place, all we need to do is make our object. So let's make a simple mesh cylinder. There's our cylinder. I'm going to reduce its properties. Get that down to 5. Decrease the radius. Let's make this a stick or pole. So 0.1. And depth, let's make this 7. So we've got a stick. Next, in the Object menu, Object, Shade Smooth. This will just smooth the surfaces so that we're looking at one continuous surface, which makes our elongated cylinder look like a stick. So that's the mesh. Now we need to add a material. Select the mesh, Material Properties, click New. That adds a material and propagates it with some basics. Let's preview. We can change the color if we want. So click on Base Color. Click Type, change the name. Just call it Stick. And then next we need to add an image to the UV map that's created or generated by default. So for that, I want to go into Shading Workspace, and to the node editor at the bottom, we add Texture, Image Texture. Drop that into place, so click Drop, and then click Drag Color Output to Base Color Input. So that'll just change the color of our object, and then what we want to do is click New and create a new image. We'll just call this Stick. And as this is a long, thin object, it'll mean that the width is much smaller than the object's height. Let's go with 64 by 512. Change the generated type, color grid, and then OK. And we have our temporarily generated image assigned to our object. So what we need to do next, in Browse Image to be Linked, click the picture icon, scroll down, find our image, there it is, Stick. That's our texture, that's generated. Now we need to save this, so click the hamburger, Image, Save As. Find our location that we want to save to, stick PNG, 0 compression if we want, and then save as image. And what this does is it converts the generated temporary image data into a bitmap, and this will save us some problems later on. So now we've got our basic material. That's all we need to do is add an image texture and then save the generated data as a bitmap. Then once we've got that, switch to UV editing. The object will have a UV map by default. This is it. We're going to switch to island. That allows us to select independent elements of our UV. Click, shift click. Switch to the universal tool. Click drag on a border. That allows us to change the shape. Drag those down. And then we can change the shape of the sides of the stick. So if we switch to, so click drag to move the header, we can see the image assigned to our object. And that is essentially step 1. So we've basically created the stick or the mesh that is the accessory. So switch to layout. What we want to do is save this. So file, save as, so we have a restore point. Next, we need to move this into position. So we're going to use the widgets and position it where we want it. So move, rotate, and we can use the universal tool that has all the widgets combined to position it where we want. So that's step 2. We've positioned it. Next step is to link the mesh with the armature. So before we do that, let's just save a version of this so we have a restore point. So to make the link, make sure our mesh is selected. Then in the tool, we want to click Bind to Armature. So make sure our mesh is selected, click. That will make the connection between the mesh and the armature, and we can check this in 2 ways. Select our mesh, modify our properties, and we should have the armature modifier assigned to our mesh that creates the association or the link between the mesh and the armature. So that's one way we can check. Again, make sure the object is selected. Similarly, if we go into Object Data Properties, we should now have a set of vertex groups, one group for each bone of the avatar. And what we want to do is weight paint, so we want to make a link between the mesh and a particular bone. In this case, we're just going to use the hand. So that's RT hand. So what we want to do is find RT hand in the list. There it is. So click select, make sure the mesh is selected. Then in the toolkit again, we want to click on paint weights. This will toggle the interface and switches into weight paint mode. So we've now got the tools available. All we need to do is paint the vertices of our mesh And as we are using full weight and full strength, they will be red when they are painted. And this basically means that RT hand has 100% influence over the entire mesh, or at least the vertices that we are painting red. And we can test this. So that's done. We can test this. So let's exit paint weights mode. So click the button again. So this button toggles in and out. To test this, we can click the pose button, and that switches us into pose mode, which means that we can grab the bones of the skeleton, press the G key and move, and we find that our stick, our mesh, moves with the armature. So click pose again, toggle out. So before we save this and export, select our mesh, and what we want to do is remove all these redundant and unused vertex groups. So select and click the minus button. You can't multi-select, so these have to be done individually. Being careful not to delete the one that we want. Scroll up to the top. Delete all of them except the one that we want. RT hand. So let's double check. Pose mode. And we're still moving. That's okay. So let's save the file. Version of save. File, save as 3. And then what we want to do is export, because that's essentially all we need to do. Just create the object, so we're making the mesh, and then connecting it to the skeleton, and then weight painting, so that the particular bone that we select has 100% control over our object. So once we've got that, all we need to do is export. So select the mesh, and then shift click the skeleton, and then click on the export button in the export tool. Export. And that creates our first FBX file. Next, what we want to do is append our stick into the animation tool so that we can create a pose with it. Before we do that, however, we can check that our stick works and import it into Studio in its current form as just a mesh. So in Studio, create a new project, and we're going to derive from one of the base avatars, so PID 191 or 80 for the female. There's the male avatar. Select, derive. So that's the male avatar. All we need to do is import our mesh. So click on the import icon and then import FBX. We need to find our file, stick, there it is, stick 3, and then just click open. So that's the preview. Set up FBX. We need to set a mesh ID, a random mesh ID. Everything else is okay. Next. It's got our material. Next. Preview. That's what it's going to bring in. And then import. And it'll do this because it's brought in the avatar skeleton, which we don't need. So, component, skeleton, root node. So in asset, we need to reset the skeleton. So click the list, and we have female 04 anime. Select, preview. That resets the avatar, and there is our stick in the avatar's hand. So that's part one. We know the stick works. So back into Blender. So back in Blender, we need to reset the scene. So File, New, General. Again, this just makes sure that we are starting from a clean scene, so the tool brings in all the correct components that are needed for the particular task at hand. General, don't save. And then View, Sidebar, Toolkit, and this time we want the animation tool. Expand, and then click on Append Animation File. That loads in the avatar with a pose rig. So each one of these poses a particular aspect of the avatar. So before we actually create the pose, what we want to do is append or import our mesh. So File, Append. This brings up the dialog, the file dialog. We need to find our file, stick, which is there, stick 3, double click. We want object, double click, and then we should find our stick in here somewhere called cylinder. There it is. So select, deactivate active collection. We just want to bring in the mesh itself. Select, instance, and localize all. Those are okay. Click append. This will bring in our stick, and it will bring in a dependency, which is the skeleton. We don't need that. So to select and delete it, the avatar at the moment is in pose mode, so we need to switch out of pose mode. So in our mode selector, switch to object mode, so we can then select and delete the object. That's all we need is the stick itself, so the mesh itself. So again, let's save this so that we have a restore point. Save as. Stick 4. And then before we make the pose, we need to create a link between our object, our mesh, and the avatar rig, which is the hand in this case. So select the mesh, then in modifier properties, we need to check that the armature modifier is still assigned to the mesh, which it is, and then in object we want to click on the little box, and from the list select anim. This is the object that we are linking to that controls our mesh. So if we select that, we should find that the mesh will jump into the avatar's hand. So click select, and there it goes. And we can test this selecting the rig, go back into pose mode because we exited pose mode to delete that unused or unnecessary skeleton. Then all we need to do is test to make sure that our stick moves with the avatar, and it does. And that's all we need to do. So we're making an association between the mesh and the rig. So once we've got that in place, we can pose the character. So press G to grab and R to rotate. So G to grab, R to rotate. G to move, R to rotate. Watch out for the elbows. So these are the elbow controls. R to rotate. Elbow control. Make the character look like it's about to smack something with the stick. Alter the fingers. And for this, what we can do is use the widgets. That gives us more finite control. And we also want to switch the rotational axis or the orientation. At the moment it's at global, which means it's associated or orientated relative to the scene. But we want local, which means the axis changes to the bones orientation. That gives us better control over what we're doing. So select the bones, or the bone controls, manipulate our avatar pose. So there's our quick pose. So before we export this, what we need to do before we do anything else, make sure we've got everything selected. So select all. And then click Add Key. And this adds a keyframe from our pose into the timeline. So we get a series of markers appearing in the timeline. What we could also have done before we started making the pose is enabled auto key, and this will have added a pose marker to the timeline as we manipulated the bones. So if we enable this now, click, and we move the avatar, it will automatically place a marker in the timeline as we pose the bone without our needing to manually do that. So that is our completed pose. So save the file, File, Save As. Now, as we're making a pose, before we export, we need to enable Make Pose and Export All Bones, because we want to make sure that all the bones of the avatar that we are posing override the defaults. So check these two options. If we wanted specific custom bones to be animated but leave the underlying defaults for the avatar, we can deselect Export All Bones, and that will mean that, for example, if we have the hand waving and that's all we wanted, we could export that without any issue and it would still play with the default avatar animations. So we've got those done, and again all we need to do to export is click the export button. So click, it'll do its thing and export an FBX for us. So the next thing is to assemble this into Studio alongside our stick FBX, which we imported previously. So in IMVU Studio we can add the FBX that we just exported to the project that we've already got open. So we know that the mesh is imported correctly and is in the right place in the avatar's hand. So all we need to do now, import FBX again, find our file, stick 5, open, we'll go through the import process again. That's the preview, so it's found a skeleton and animation. Set up FBX. We don't need to change anything here, so that's all right. Next, no materials, obviously. There's our animation. Review, import. It'll do this again because we've imported a skeleton that IMVU can't use. So back into component again, skeleton again, and then in asset, as we did before, reset to female 04. Preview, and there we are, back to normal. Now we can switch to actions, and we have the pre-populated actions that exist with the avatar. And all we need to do is stance standing, click on the config or the more button, then config, that gives us the panel. Click on the asset drop down and we should have our sequence at the bottom. There it is. So select, set in place. We'll leave the other bits for the moment. Do that to all of them. Then preview, and that should give us our sequence. We know that works, so go back to the properties, frame 2, 0, replace, preview, config, and there is our pose. 0 to loop. And we have to do this to each of these sequences or these ensembles to ensure that the sequence plays whenever this avatar is worn. Because as you remove items, the avatar resets and will play a different sequence or different ensemble every time you change something. So we have to change all of them to make sure that we're playing the same one all the time, regardless as to what's going on. And there is our pose. Let's remove the closed sticks. So inventory, in use, remove, and remove. And that is our pose. And keep in mind as well that because we're using scalars, that we may get some gaps or displacement relative to the pose. So always double check. Scalars, and then maybe reset everything back to the default, so we know that the pose works as intended. So it does. So always bear that in mind. But that is our accessory item with custom pose using IMVU Studio Toolkit. All that's then needed is to save the project and then upload to the catalogue.